Hello and welcome. My name is Kara Balog. I am with the Shasta Resource Conservation District. This is a monthly series. This is the Rainbow Ridge Forest Stewardship Workshop Series. We put on different topics every month to bring in various experts, mostly local, but sometimes regional, to come and talk to us about things having to do with forestry in our landscapes and how to properly manage them. So today, very exciting, we have two experts in the fields of geology and ecology here to talk to us about why our landscape looks like what it does. Our first speaker is Dr. Bill Hirt. Dr. Bill Hirt is a geology instructor with Ecology-Siskiyou since 1991. He got his PhD in geology from UC Santa Barbara. Our second speaker here is Dr. Rob Fernau, who's in the audience right now. He is a biodiversity researcher. He's been working in the Marble Mountains since 1984. And he's an affiliate with UC Davis. He got his PhD at UC Davis as well. So we'll get right into this. Right beforehand, I do want to say we do have some flyers up there. This is our last workshop for this year, but we'll be starting up again in March. And in the meantime, we do have lovely volunteer events where we'll be doing on-the-ground work, doing some cleaning up of a local Rainbow Ridge landowner we have featured up here. We also have a little flyer for Big Springs Ranch tour on the 18th and 19th. And the OrCal RC&D is putting on a conference in October about building materials for houses in order to make them more fire safe, as well as the Siskiyou Land Trust annual fundraiser. So feel free to take a look at any of these flyers at your convenience, but we're going to start. And so I'd like to welcome Dr. Bill Hirt up.
Thanks, Karen. Thank you all for being here today. So I'm the first half of this double bill, and so my job is to go ahead and sort of introduce the geology of Siskiyou County. And the emphasis here is going to be sort of on, there's a tremendous diversity of rock types exposed in the county, and there's a very long history behind that. Those rocks in turn are the foundation for the soils, and then combine that with the microclimates we have between the diverse soils, the diverse microclimates. The biota are very diverse, and then that will be Rob's presentation. So let's see. Are we going to have the lights up or down, or?
Down.
I think maybe down a little bit. This might be bright enough to see it. Okay, so y'all sort of know this angle here. We're in a plain above Castle Crags, looking back at Mount Shasta. And probably this one image sort of sets the stage for this introduction to the geology of Siskiyou County. We have some very old rocks exposed in the Klamath Mountains, and then some much younger rocks exposed in the high Cascades. And so that's really part of that diversity. But the interesting thing is, as diverse as those rocks are, the process that produced them is the same in both cases. This area has had a long history of subduction. So we'll do a little bit on plate tectonics, introduce subduction, and then sort of walk through the county geology in a historical order, kind of mostly from west to east, and look at what's happening. Okay, so here's a geologic map. This is the geologic map of California, but I've superimposed Siskiyou County on here so that you can see it. And it really stands out, right? The western half of the county is mostly here in blues and purples and reds. These are the old rocks of the Klamath Mountains. And then the eastern part of the county is mostly pinks and yellows. These are volcanic rocks of the high Cascades and the sediments in the basins between. So there's a big subdivision in the middle of the county. These are old rocks, anywhere up to about 400 million years old. And the Cascade rocks, the Cascade arc has been active for about 35 million years. So big difference in age, tenfold difference in age. So just a really quick introduction. So everybody knows if we cut the earth open, what's it filled with? Soft, yummy gum. Right? So seismic data tell us that about the middle center part of the earth, about halfway out, is iron-nickel alloy. Does it have a relevance to our daily lives?
Gravity.
It does help increase gravity for sure. How many of you used a compass to navigate? We think the planet's magnetic field arises from circulation in the outer core, the molten outer core. But other than that, the core isn't going to play a role in today's presentation. So then above that, there's a thick zone about 2,900 kilometers thick, the Earth's mantle. And any of you born in August? Really? Nobody in August? Okay. Well, if you were born in August, your birthstone would be peridot, that beautiful green gemstone. That's what the Earth's mantle is made of. It's basically a one mineral part of the Earth. It's made mostly of the mineral olivine. It's a magnesium iron silicate. And we're going to see that there are places in Siskiyou County where altered upper mantle has been pushed up to the surface. And since it's such a simple material, basically magnesium silicate, there's not the potassium and the calcium and the other elements that plants need. So these areas with serpentinite, which is altered upper mantle rock, tend to be very different biologically because of the unusual chemistry of the rock. Okay, then the very upper part here is the crust, right? Which, how thick is the Earth's crust? Not very, right? So under the oceans, it's really thin. They're proposing again to try to drill through it. It's about 7 kilometers or 4 miles thick. So it's maybe the distance from here to Black Butte. Yeah, it's very thin. And it's made mostly of basalt, the rock that you see erupting out of volcanoes in the Hawaiian Islands. And then under the continent, the crust is a real dog's breakfast. There's sedimentary rocks, metamorphic rocks, granites. It's very diverse. But if you ground it all up into a hopper, it would be roughly a granite in composition. And it's quite a bit thicker than the ocean crust, but still it's not very thick. The distance from Wee to Wairika, roughly, is the average thickness of the continental crust. So the crust really is only the very outermost part of the planet. But then what's happened, since Earth was young, it's radiated a lot of heat away into space, and the upper part of the mantle, the upper part of that peridotite layer, has cooled and is rigid. It's still very hot, but it's cool enough that it's rigid, and it hugs the bottom of the crust and goes everywhere with it. So when we talk about plates and plate tectonics, the plates aren't crust. They're actually crust plus this cold, rigid upper mantle. Okay? That collectively is the lithosphere. And you'll see a plate map in a moment, and you'll see some plates have continental crust on top of them, some plates have oceanic, some have both, right? But the plate itself is that crust plus the cold, rigid upper mantle underneath it. Okay, now last thing. As you go down into the Earth, what happens to temperature? It gets hotter, doesn't it? Yeah. So below about 150 kilometers, about 90 miles, the upper mantle is hot enough that when earthquake waves go through it, they slow way down. They're attenuated. And we think that's because there's a small amount of melt there. Not a lot, maybe 1% or 2%, something like that. But it's just enough to serve as a lubricant. So whenever stress is put on that part of the Earth, that material can flow to accommodate that stress. And that layer extends down to about 350 kilometers. Below that, it's even hotter, but the greater pressure means there's no melt. Okay, so today Earth has this layer that's soft, that has just a few % melt in it. Now what this means is, if I push on a plate sideways, what will happen? It can slide through that soft asthenosphere, can't it? Right? If I put a big ice cap on a plate, what will the weight do? Push the plate down into the asthenosphere. If I melt the ice cap off, what will the plate do? Bob back up, like parts of northern Europe and northern Canada are today, right? So basically, plate tectonics is possible because those dense, rigid plates float on that softer asthenosphere underneath. What would happen if Earth's asthenosphere completely solidified? No plate motion, right? Welcome to Mars, right? Mars is only about half as big as Earth is, and we see early in Mars history it apparently did have plate tectonics, or something like plate tectonics, but because it's so much smaller, it's radiated a lot more heat away into space compared to its size, so its asthenosphere is now locked up, and there's no plate motion on Mars today. So basically this whole thing works because the upper crust and upper mantle are rigid, form these plates, and then the asthenosphere underneath is soft and enables them to move across the planet's surface. Okay, so what do they look like? Well, there's the plate map. I've gone into this. Whoever did this map, it was great, except they had these two boundaries reversed. They had the Americian plate, and North Americian and South Americian plate. So I've done some fixing on this diagram. Okay, but these are the plate boundaries on Earth. And so, for example, here's the African plate, right? The Arabian plate's not labeled. North America consists not only of the North American continent, but also the western half of the Atlantic Ocean. And on Earth, most of the interesting stuff doesn't occur in the interiors of the plates. It occurs at plate boundaries, right? Where two plates are moving past one another. So you've got three choices. One type of plate boundary involves pulling the two plates apart. And as I do, what's that hot, soft stuff underneath going to try to do? Well up towards the surface, partially melts, makes magmas that heal the fracture, then you pull it apart some more. So you can see, oops, I can't pull it this pen, how this part of South America sort of fits into this part of Africa, and this part of Africa, this is terrible, sort of fits into this part of North America. This is because the Atlantic Ocean has opened during the past 250 million years or so. So this is one of those divergent boundaries where two plates are sliding apart and new ocean floor lithosphere is growing as a result. Now, if that's happening and Earth isn't getting any bigger, what do I have to be doing somewhere else? I have to be getting rid of some of the plates, right? And so that happens at these red boundaries. They're called convergent boundaries. And if one of the plates is oceanic, it will bend down and actually sink back into the Earth's interior. And that process of a piece of ocean lithosphere sinking back into the planet's interior, that's subduction. And a lot of the history of Siskiyou County's geology can be traced back to that single process. Okay? And you can see, it's a little hard to see, but we live along a subduction boundary today. I'll enlarge this in the next picture. Okay? Do you suppose those plates go quietly down into the Earth? Not so much, right? They stick and slip, stick and slip. When was the last big earthquake here in the Pacific Northwest?
1956.
The last big one, actually, was in January of 1700, January 26, 1700. Magnitude 9.2, approximately. Wow. The size of the Tohoku quake that hit Japan a year or so ago. Right? But that's the last time the Cascadia subduction zone ripped and slipped as a unit. Now that was prior to Northern Europeans coming here and settling. The Native American oral tradition records the quake. But we expect to see big quakes like that again from the Cascadia subduction.
Do you have an idea where the epicenter was?
It actually started to rip in the north, and then the whole fault ripped, the whole subduction zone ripped going southward. Yeah. And then the third type of boundary, the plates aren't moving apart, they're not converging. They're simply sliding horizontally past one another. Those are shear boundaries or transform boundaries, and of course, what's the most famous one in California? That's right. It's kind of small on a world scale, but there it is. So those are their plates are not being made or destroyed there, just sliding laterally past one. So since we're in Siskiyou County, we're along a modern convergent boundary, we want to look at this in a little more detail. Move that chair. Okay, so here's a map of the Cascadia subduction zone. And today there are actually three little platelets. The Explorer, the Wanda Fuca, and the Gorda. And North America is moving this way. And these are ridges that are spreading. So these plates are moving this way, and they're sliding under the western edge of North America. Now the blue dots on here are earthquake epicenters. Okay? So you can see the seismicity that's associated with the subduction zone. And then the red triangles are the young high cascade volcanoes. So here's Shasta, Lassen, Medicine Lake, Crater Lake, Blueberry, so on. And so there's volcanism associated with it, but you can see the volcanism isn't right along the plate boundary, is it? It's actually well inland. And these purple contours actually show you how deep the downgoing plate is when you get to the volcanic arc. So most of the volcanism occurs when the plate's down at about 100 kilometers. Okay. So we want to look at why that is. But this is the current situation here in Northern California and the Pacific Northwest. Okay, so this is a little block diagram of that. So I said sinking ocean lithosphere. It's really going to do three things that are of interest to us. One, as this plate sinks, some of the sediment that sits on top of it and some pieces of the plate itself get essentially plastered up against the leading edge of the continent. That's one thing that happens. The second thing that happens is, of course, this sticks, and then from time to time it breaks, and the plates slide. All that strain that's been building up is released suddenly as one of these big subduction zone earthquakes. And then the third thing that happens, as we're going to see in a minute, this plate is wet as it goes down, right? So it's taking water with it into the earth. And remember, when you get down to the asthenosphere, there's already a little bit of melt there. If you add water, you get a lot of melt, okay? And that melt, being less dense than the rock around it, just like warm air, will rise. Now, most of it never makes it to the surface. About 10% of it does find its way to the surface and erupts to form the high Cascade volcanoes. The other 90% stalls in the crust, cools, crystallizes, forms bodies of rock like castle crags, what are called plutons. And we only see them if they're uplifted later, okay, exposed by erosion. So as a sinking ocean lithosphere plasters sediments and oceanic rock against the leading edge of the continent, yep. It creates large earthquakes when the plates come unstuck, and it adds water to the asthenosphere that triggers partial melting and volcanism. Okay, now, it's one thing to see a cartoon of this. It would be better if it were moving, right? Let's make it move. Okay, hold on. Through the magic of computer technology. Okay, so this is an animation of a continental margin subduction zone with the ocean lithosphere sinking. Watch for water. Now, water is cooked out of the plate all the way down, but it doesn't really do much for us until we get to a depth where the rock is almost on the edge of melting anyways. Then adding that water lowers the melting temperature further and produces magmas. By the way, you guys remember we looked at that picture of the Cascade arc, and the Cascade volcanoes were lined up in a line, but there weren't any volcanoes farther east. What's the story? What happens when you cook out the water? Yeah, once the water's gone, the fun stops, right? So, okay. So let's put this in motion and see what it looks like. Okay, so ocean lithosphere sinking, scraping and adding material into this wedge, releasing water, triggering melting, and then those magmas rise. Most of them cool and solidify in the crust, but a small fraction find their way to the surface and erupt toward volcanoes. Okay? Make sense? And this animation is courtesy of Tanya Atwater and her students at UC Santa Barbara. Okay. All right, so let's go back. Now, one more cool thing that has ramifications for Siskiyou County. This is where we want to be. Sometimes the crust, the lithosphere, the ocean plate, has a thickened place on it. This could be an island chain, think Japan, built on top of the Pacific plate. Or this could be a hotspot island, think Hawaii, and it's the other islands in the Hawaiian chain. But the crust is too thick, okay? And so when the lithosphere goes to subduct, it doesn't want to go down. And instead, it sort of jams up the subduction zone. And eventually, the stresses cause the lithosphere to break behind that. And that new piece of material is effectively added to the edge of the continent. Okay? That's terrain accretion. And that's what's built the Klamath Mountains, essentially. Okay? So here are two little block diagrams. Here's a thickened part of the oceanic crust, maybe a set of islands from a hot spot underneath the oceanic plate. And it comes in, it collides with the subduction zone, and essentially shuts off subduction. And then the plate breaks behind it, and subduction begins again behind it. Okay? And we've essentially added this piece of oceanic lithosphere to the continent by doing that. Okay? That's how the Klamaths have grown. Klamaths are a series of accreted oceanic arcs, mostly, that have collided with the western edge of North America. And again, I think an animation is worth 1,000 still pictures. This worked in rehearsal. So here's a cartoon that shows how that works. There's our thickened piece of lithosphere, collides, jams up the subduction zone, shuts off subduction, and now this thickened piece that was attached to the oceanic plate is part of the continent. Right? It's been added to the continent. Subduction may start out here, and guess what? Another terrain will come in and collide and build the continent even bigger. And when we look at the Klamaths, we can actually see those belts that have been added. Oops. I'm not used to doing it without a mouse. Okay, so this is a geologic map of the Klamath Mountains, and it shows the major subdivisions of the Klamaths, right? Over here is what's called the Eastern Klamath terrain. These pink things are magmas that have come up and solidified to make these plutons in the crust, things like castle crags. And then you can see there's another belt of somewhat younger rocks. Oh, there's actually the Central Metamorphic terrain, which is plastered against the Eastern Klamath terrain. Then the Western Paleozoic terrain here, right? Then the Western Klamath terrain, right? And then today, the modern subduction is scraping off material and adding it to what's called the Franciscan belt. So this gives you a sense of how the Klamath Mountains have grown, right? The oldest terrain is off to the east. And how far do these terrains go over? Well, if you go east through Oregon, you don't really get to native North America, old North American crust, until almost the eastern side of Oregon. Okay? So pretty much all of Oregon, quite a bit of northern Nevada, the Sierra Nevada west in California, those are all accreted terrains. They're not native to North America. They've been added through this process. So there's a long history of subduction along the western edge of the continent, and lithosphere that's too thick to subduct comes in, collides, and gets added to the leading edge of the continent. Okay, and so what are you going to think about in terms of diversity of rocks in the Klamath? It's going to be really diverse, right? And so I'm not going to try to walk you through anything in detail, but think about, mostly you're thinking about oceanic terrains, right? Things that were islands out offshore and have come in and been added. So you're going to expect basalt, the ocean floor crust. If those islands came from the tropics, you might expect some reefs, right? Things like that. Okay, so what's in the Klamaths? Okay. So one thing that's pretty amazing, sometimes when that oceanic lithosphere is trying to subduct, it breaks internally, and some of it actually gets pushed up onto the continent. And here in the eastern Klamaths, this is Mount Eddy from the west, and you have the Serpentinite, right? This is altered upper mantle rock, so it's mantle peridotite that's been altered by hot water. At a mid-ocean ridge, when you pull the lithosphere apart, seawater gets down in there and it interacts with the hot mantle rock that's at a relatively shallow depth and turns it to the serpentine. You can see the asbestos veins in here. And then that normally this would have been subducted, but in the western Klamath, we get pieces of this that have been pushed up onto the continent. Okay? So that's a pretty unique rock type. And like I said, because this is basically magnesium silicate, and that's all, it lacks the potassium, the calcium, the aluminum, the other nutrients that plants need, right? So you have the really specialized adaptations like Darlingtonia that catches bugs in order to make up for the nutrients that the soil on the serpentine lacks. So another thing that's pretty cool, how many of you have been to Lake Shasta caverns? Okay, so there are some big blocks of limestone incorporated into Klamaths. And if you think about a chain of volcanic islands out in the western Pacific, if they're in the tropics, you know, what is it, within about 20 degrees latitude of the equator, it's warm enough, they'll grow coral reefs around them, right? And then when those islands are subducted, those coral reefs are brought in, added to the continent, and they're the limestones and the marbles of the Klamath Mountains, they're reef deposits. Those of you who've been to Lake Shasta caverns know that the limestone down there, the McLeod limestone, is famous for these horn corals, these long horn-shaped, they were solitary corals, they are extinct now. But what's really interesting is there were horn corals living in North America. These are not them. Okay? These horn corals relatives lived off of Asia. They're what they call a tepian fauna. And so the islands that they were living on were carried all the way across the Pacific and added to North America. And the question was, well, how far did they come from? Well, they came from far enough that genetically these corals and the horn corals that lived in North America never saw each other. They never interbred. So they've come a long ways. Yeah, some of the blocks in the Klamath have done some serious traveling. Okay. And then another rock type that's really prominent in the Klamath. So that process of subduction, remember, partially melt the asthenosphere, those magmas come up, they lodge in the crust, melt the crust, and make magmas that ascend and stall in the crust, cool, crystallize underground. Those are granites. And in the Klamath, it's mostly true granite, and then some related rocks called diorite that are a little bit richer in iron and magnesium. And in the Klamath, of course, the granite weathers, the bane of road builders, right? The DG, the decomposed granite. But we do have, a lot of the soils in the Klamath are derived from the breakdown of granites and diorites, rocks that came up as these magmas cooled and solidified, and then have been exposed as the Klamaths have been uplifted. So I don't want to walk you through all. The Klamaths are incredibly diverse. I haven't said anything about the metasedimentary rocks. I haven't talked at all about greenstones and the altered lavas of the seafloor crust. There's a huge diversity of rocks there. But just to give you a taste, the serpentinite, the limestone, and granite, it's a very diverse province geologically. Okay, now, let's come forward in time. So most of this terrain accretion occurred between 400 million years ago is an upper limit, and through about 100 million years ago, 140 million years ago. So after 140 million years, no new terranes have been really added to the western edge of North America, but North America has been moving westward, and oceanic lithosphere is still subducting under the western edge of the continent. So this cartoon is drawn sort of slicing across just north of our latitude at about 100 million years ago. Actually, this is today, but it could be 100 million years ago. Things haven't changed that much. So two key things that are important for understanding the geology of Siskiyou County. First of all, subduction is still continuing. So material is being scraped off that downgoing plate. This would be that Franciscan formation that we saw in the earlier map. And as that stuff gets wedged under, what's going to happen to the leading edge of the continent? It's going to get lifted up, right? You wedge some stuff under there and jack it up a little bit. And we can see uplift in the Klamaths, right? You have a very old drainage superimposed on what was almost a flatline region before the uplift began. So one thing that happens is we're lifting the Klamath Mountains. Now this is, like I say, this is drawn for Oregon, so they show the coast range, which are in the same position. The second thing that happens is as you lift the leading edge of the continent, you tend to make a valley, a long linear valley, parallel to the subduction zone back here. South of us, in most of California, that's the Central Valley, Sacramento, San Joaquin. In our region, with the Klamaths being there, it's not as wide or as obvious, but that's the Shasta Valley, is the remnant of that. North of us, that's the Willamette Valley, right? And I guess the Rogue Valley, yeah. So basically, as subduction occurs, the Klamaths are being lifted, and also you're developing this valley back behind the leading mountain range that's accumulating sediment. Okay? And we see both of those in this area. So first of all, if you go and look at, how many of you have looked at the Hornbrook Formation? Yeah. Cretaceous, mostly sandstones and shales. It's the sediment that accumulated when that long skinny valley, the ocean was still in it. Right? And you can see here some clam and scallop fossils, right, that accumulated in the Hornbrook. Parts of the easternmost Hornbrook actually have a little bit of coal in them, suggesting we were getting into sort of swampy areas off to the east. And then probably farther east, that would have been where the active volcanic arc was at that time, about 100 million years ago. So that basin is called the Forearc Basin. And in this area, it would be the Shasta Valley. And it's at depth, we have the Hornbrook Formation, which is uprooted sandstone. Okay. The other thing that's happened that's pretty cool is that as material has been sort of pushed in under the leading edge of the continent, the Klamaths have come up, the rocks that sat on top of the basement have slid off, some to the north and some to the south. And so in our area, when you go up into Mount Eddy and you see the Serpentine and such exposed, north of that's the Wairika terrain. That used to be on top of, and as the Trinities have come up, that's sort of slid north on this, what they call a detachment fault. And then the same thing has happened as this has come up, this rock has slid off. And Rainbow Ridge, which is the part of the subject of this presentation, is some of the old sedimentary rock that has slid off to the south. The Shasta Caverns rock would be down in this terrain too. So as the gabbro and serpentinite have come up, then the rocks that were on top have slid off. Okay, real quickly. So what's happening today? Well, around 35 million years ago, we had a volcanic arc developed along the western edge of the continent, and you don't see a lot of it in Siskiyou County today, but it's there if you know where to look. Here's Sheep Rock. That's an outcrop of the old western Cascade volcanics. If you go down to the dam, the Lake Siskiyou Dam, Box Canyon Dam, the rock that the dam is secking is western Cascade volcanics. Okay. Now, for some reason, around 15 million years ago, maybe a little earlier than that, this volcanic arc shut off. Okay. Then it was quiet for a while, and then subduction resumed, and the arc became active again. We have the modern high cascade. So why did it shut off? This is really cool. Okay. What we think is, you guys all know where Yellowstone is, right? Okay. Yellowstone is a mantle plume, a body of hot rock that has come up through the mantle, and as it reaches near the surface, it undergoes partial melting and produces lavas. And basically what happened is that plume, North America is moving southwestward. So Yellowstone is where it is today, but if you put everything back to where Yellowstone was when it rose 17 million years ago, it would be a lot closer to the coast than it is today. And what we think is that the Yellowstone plume actually came up, ran into the sinking Borda-Wanda-Fuca plate, and actually stalled out subduction. That's why the Western Cascades shut down. Then, as North America continued to drift southwest, the effect was to move that plume eastward. It no longer impinged on the sinking plate, and normal subduction began again, and the modern high cascades emerged. So we think that the pause in volcanic activity that we see here in Siskiyou County is related to the ascent of the Yellowstone plume. Okay, so we have high cascade volcanism. So you guys all know the modern high cascades, here we're looking out across the Shasta Valley, here's Goose Nest. They're mostly basalt volcanoes, shields, cinder cones. It's fairly much basalt volcanism. But then scattered across it are these larger andesite stratovolcanoes like Mount Shasta. Okay. So regional basalt volcanism, sometimes shields, sometimes flows. Here's the Pluto Cave basalt, about 160,000 years old, part of this regional basalt volcanism, but an important aquifer in the Shasta Valley. Okay. And then in places where a lot of that mafic magma has lodged in the crust, partially melted the crust, you produce andesite lavas, and those build the large stratovolcanoes like Mount Shasta. These are andesite and dacite pyroclastic flow deposits down along Mud Creek, but very different type of lava than the basalts. The basalt is coming into the crust, melting the crust, and then producing these lavas. Okay. So very quickly, a couple of key events in the recent history. You know that beginning around 600,000 years ago, a volcano grew where modern Mount Shasta is today. And around 300,000 years ago, for reasons that are not entirely clear, the north side of that old volcano simply gave way, and it collapsed as a big debris avalanche that swept north-northwest out across the Shasta Valley. All these little hills and hummocks that you see lying on the floor of the valley are chunks of the old mountain that were carried bodily in that debris avalanche and set down as the avalanche came to rest. It simply buried the underlying valley. The modern mountain has grown since that avalanche, so it's grown on the stump of old ancestral Mount Shasta. There have been 4 eruptive episodes. From this view on the north, you really can't see the Sergeant's Ridge cone, the first one, but if you go up to the old ski bowl, you're right in the guts of the Sergeant's Ridge cone. And then the Misery Hill cone grew second between about 30 and 50,000 years ago. You can see part of it up here. Shastina grew third, right, about 9,500 years ago. And then since about 9,000 years ago, the Hoffman cone has added this part of Mount Shasta. So ongoing, well, the last eruptions were about 200 years ago. So the mountain's dormant right now, certainly not in that state. So my sort of overall point was really diverse geology, and as a result, really diverse soils. And then that's going to interact with our microclimates to give us the diverse biology that we're going to look at next. And another issue is with the large stratovolcanoes, you have these very permeable cones over less permeable rocks underneath. So water percolates in, then when it can't go down any farther, it finds its way out of the springs that help feed the Shasta River. There's a big spring on the McCloud River. So that's another aspect of the geology, that it controls that tendency to have springs because we have permeable volcanics above less permeable rocks in the basin. And I think that's it.
All right, if everyone can hold on. If you can hold on to your questions until the end, we're going to go to the next presentation. Thanks a lot, Bill, for explaining to why the landscape looks like it does. Now we're going to turn to the ecological side. So what's growing on top of all those rocks? And I'd like to invite Dr. Fernau to do that.
All right.
Good to go.
All right, which button was this?
This advances the slides.
All right, that's good. Oh. Thanks. Thanks for coming. Boy, getting ready for this, although I've been doing research in the Marble Mountains for this is my 25th year, I realize how little I know about Siskiyou County. It's a fascinating place, but I'm just a Marble Mountain guy, so it's been good for me to get around a little bit. I'd like to start out by showing you the most famous biogeographical slide ever made by Alfred Russel Wallace. It was published in 1876. This is the guy with Charles Darwin. They came up with the theory together, well, independently, for the theory of natural selection to explain the diversity of life on Earth. So this basically says that this is for animals, the zoogeographical regions of the world. So if you look at the whole planet, where are the major places where the animals are? If you have to divide them up into a modest number, basically this whole area here is Eurasia, the northern part of North America, and basically all Eurasia, north of the Himalayas. So that's kind of the big picture for animals. Now let's look at plants. Plants came much later. This is Takhtajan, a Russian fellow, published the major floristic regions of the world. So there's more of those. It's kind of idiosyncratic how many there actually are. But just kind of compare. Okay, look, Eurasia up there, it's pretty much similar. Then you look at some of these areas and they're really small, like Southwest Africa, which we'll go into, Southwestern Australia, Mediterranean. And I just want to point out, California is kind of obscured there a little bit, embedded in another floristic region. But that's kind of two different views, the animals and the plants for the world. And now it turns out that everybody knows the most diverse areas in the world are the tropics, right? For plants and animals and butterflies and bunny rabbits and the birds and the bees and the flowers and the trees and all that. But outside of the tropics, for the whole planet, it's the Mediterranean areas that have the most species of plants and the most endemic species of plants. And whenever you use that word endemic, you always have to attach it to endemic to certainly a defined area. So if you talk about, hey, that's an endemic, well, a biologist say, endemic to what? This mountaintop or the state or the planet or whatever. So when you use the word endemic, I always say it's endemic to Siskiyou County or endemic to China, China Peak or something like that. But here they are, there's 5 Mediterranean climates in the world. And what's a Mediterranean climate? It's just an area in the summertime, it doesn't rain. So that's a whole other story why, but they're pretty, it has to do with tectonics, and the water comes from South America, from around Antarctica. It's really old, but you get upwelling on the west sides of continents. That's the big picture. So it's cold water. And the newest thinking is they really came to full development, the Mediterranean climates of the world, only in the last 3 million years. So it's fairly recent. So that's pretty interesting to me, and I couldn't believe it. And that's 2013 is published. So here they are, the Mediterranean regions of the world, the area, the number of species, and the percent of endemism, percent of species that are limited to the particular region you see on the left. So it turns out, number one, if you factor in area and all this stuff, the Cape region of southwestern Africa is number one. That little tiny area you saw in the Floristic region of the world. Number 2 is southwestern Australia. California and the Mediterranean, although the Mediterranean is much bigger, they're tied for 3rd place, and Chile comes in 4th. So basically, our California floristic region, worldwide, outside the tropics, is amazing. It's one of the treasure troves of the whole planet. And of California, the California Floristic Province, this is the California Floristic Province, the most diverse areas for plants with the most endemics and amphibians is the Klamath area. So this is an absolutely amazing area. I went to college with the Siskious in 1971 and 72, and I just love this area, and I came back to do graduate work here, and really work on research because I knew it was interesting, but I didn't realize how interesting it was. It took me, it's just an absolutely phenomenal part of the world. I really want to go to the Cape Province in southwestern South America, Africa and Australia someday, but in the meantime, I'm happy. So here we are, the Klamath Mountains. Bill's done a great job. I wish I could have seen that before. It would have helped me with this talk. But let's see. So this is the famous quote. It's like whenever anybody gives a lecture on biodiversity of the trees and everything of the Klamath area, they always have to quote and saying that the Klamath-Siskiyou region supports nearly all the major forest types west of the Mississippi, like no other area. And it's really true. It's amazing. East of the Mississippi, we have our sister area, the Smoky Mountain, the Great Smoky Mountain National Park in the southern Appalachians. They're of central significance in the eastern part of the United States. Because there's so many species of trees there, it's really rich. In the west, we have the Klamath Mountains where we live in. One little tiny area. It was John Sawyer over at Humboldt. He was out on a field trip with Dale Thornburg back in the 60s, I think, and they found a square mile. I don't know exactly how many species, but in a square mile of Russian wilderness, they found like 17 species or 16 species of conifers in a really small area. And actually, that's a big deal, globally. People were, wow. So the other thing is, preparing for this talk, this is one thing I learned. Outside of the southeastern United States, it's the most diverse area for fish, for endemism, for species of fish, just limited to our area in the Klamath. So that's amazing. Amphibian diversity is super high, and I forget what it is, but if you look at the state records, I think it's 5th. So we live in a pretty interesting area biologically. It really is. So why? Why are there so many tree species here in the Klamath area? Well, I took this in Scott Valley in the 90s sometime, but it has a climate. The Klamath Mountains have a climate that's more similar, that have basically, they have a climate that's more like the climate that California had before the Mediterranean climate than any other part of California. So you have a lot of, it's kind of like for some species, it's sort of like a Noah's Ark. It has like ancient climates here, because you get high mountains that are cool, and you get the, mountain precipitation like this shows. It's cooler, it's close, high mountains, close to the ocean, and then the Klamath Mountains are far enough north that they intercept a lot of the Pacific Northwest, banana, what are they called? What are they called?
Pineapple Express?
Yeah, pineapple, that's it. It's not banana, it's a Pineapple Express. Thank you. Okay, so here's an example. Okay, there's different types of endemics. There's one term is a paleoendemics. Paleo, like paleontology means old, So the paleoendemics of the Klamath Mountains are those species that formerly had a much wider distribution. And now they're just relics, much smaller subsets of that bigger distribution. Here's an oak. This oak's closest relative outside the Klamath Mountains, this is Sadler's oak, is in China. So there's even Charles Darwin back in the day. Charles Darwin and was writing letters from England to Asa Gray, a famous botanist in the middle 1800s, talking about these affinities between the southeastern United States, where there's a lot of summer rain, it's warm, and the vegetation of China, just these distribution of plants globally. And now we're finding more and more there's also connections with of these paleoendemics with our area, the Klamath Mountains. So there's paleoendemics, and then there's neoendemics, new endemics that basically when the Mediterranean climate started to happen, it's a process, so summer rain stopped. So those species that were pre-adapted, that had their biologies were such and such that they were able to some of them were able to get a foothold into this new climatic regime. They underwent adaptive radiation. That's why you get some species like Ariaga and buckwheat, where there's, I forget how many, it's like 40 species in that genus. But that's what that's about. There's a few modest number of genera, the California flora, or the California floristic province, that really went haywire. They went, all right, no more summer rain, so that's interesting. Okay, so now breaking it apart. Oh, this is a really good book. If you ever get a chance, I brought some books here, but Timberline by Arno and Hammerly is a wonderful book. You can read, just read, and just enjoy. But this is the area. So there's lots of different mountains, from the Yellow Boles all the way to the Rogue River. Lots of different mountain types, and they all have their interesting histories. And now back to what Bill was talking about. So here, this is a batholith, English peak batholith. Some of you have been to English Peak, maybe? All right. This is southern distribution for Pacific silver fir. So granite types, diorite, granodiorite, the granites, they spawn soils that have a low pH, so they're basic. They're acidic. So these are acidic soils. So this is a fen. So a fen is like a bog, but it has an outlet. There's an inlet, the water comes in, the water goes out. The pH never drops too low. So there's sphagnum here. It's like a bog. There's Preston Peak, the Serpentine Mountain. But so this is an area where there are a lot of different plants that grow in acidophiles. Philic means love for acid. Acidophiles, acidophilic taxa, or acidophilic species occur in this kind of batholith type of environment. So you get a lot of interesting species there. And this is Marble Mountain. So this is, like Bill was talking about, there's not very many fossils there, hardly any. People have spent a lot of time running around for them. But this was once thought to be a coral reef surrounding, you know, a volcanic island that bashed in North America. And it turns out, this here is a global map, and I dug it up, and it shows all the basic parts of the world where there's a lot of marble or limestone. So Yucatan Peninsula, you know, there's a lot there. The Spite in Australia, there's a lot there. There's not a lot in the United States like there are. Up here, there's quite a lot. But, you know, so we have, this is basic. So the species of plants, you know, that like basic materials. So now we start with acid, now basic rocks and basic soil types. And this is a bristlecone pine. But the interesting thing ecologically is this is really open, right? It just, you know, this is like, here, that's a volcanic rock, Black Marble Mountain to the right is another major type of rock. Volcanic rocks have more nutrients, particularly the younger ones, you know. But look at how open the marble is. The water just goes through it. There's no headwater lakes on either side of the Marble Mountains. The water just goes through, comes out, you know, miles away. But the cool thing about this is, ecologically, is it mimics an alpine environment by its very openness. So you see a lot of species here that actually are alpine, that occur up worldwide, that occur above the subalpine even. They're just flat out alpine plants. And you go up there and you go, wow, they shifted down a life zone. That's kind of interesting. In the same way, if you've been to the Snake River floodplains in Idaho, there's all that basalt, and it's really open, there's not that many trees, but you find pica at the lowest elevation you find them anywhere, because it mimics. So that's another interesting thing about this place. And then you get serpentine, which has, and here's a distribution I found of serpentine in the United States. This should show everybody's talking about serpentine all the time. Well, there's not a heck of a lot of it, and it's on the edge of the continent. You know, so that's very interesting. So we have more than our fair share of serpentine. And serpentine, like Bill was saying, it's an unpleasant place for plants. Plants, you know, there's toxic things like nickel and heavy metals they don't like, and then the nutrients that they need, some of the important ones, they don't have. So it's a difficult place. So plants that can take a foothold there, they don't have that much competition. They kind of have it made in a way. But I just found this morning. Serpentine endemics of Western North America are almost completely confined to the Klamath area. So this is a really interesting area, not only for other for just serpentine endemics. Now this is mostly here on the west. This is Jeffrey Pine. In the northern part of Jeffrey Pine's range in California, it's more limited to serpentine. In the southern part, it has a broader ecological distribution. And here's a really interesting site. I've just started research on this. The guy that came up, one of the principal guys, maybe Bill can correct me on this, Porter Irwin, was at the USGS in the early 60s and late 50s. He was doing research. He's in his 90s, and he still goes to work every day from 8 to 5. I've met him and talked to him. We've gotten to know him through the years. And this is a map that he produced, and he and I were talking. I was trying to go in there and learn more about the Klamath area. Anybody that's really in the Klamath that's an old fart, I just jump on him. I say, help me, teach me something, you know. So he basically, there's this old concept of the Klamath plane, and I don't know if it's still current, but this old surface that's really old, that's way older than all the glaciation and everything. It's like all these places got eroded away by the glaciers and everything. Then this old surface on the top, and some of it, like Bill said, some of it's like sedimentary rock. You know, and this cool thing about it is, this sedimentary rock, it's like the oldest surface in this whole area along these ridge tops. It's so old and weathered that there's almost no nutrients for plants. So here we have a basic environment, an acidic environment, a toxic environment. Now we have an environment with almost no nutrients at all for plants. So that's kind of interesting. And this is where I'm starting to do research. up along these ridges here, and they're very interesting. Some of them are beaten down pretty hard, some of them are overgrazed, this and that. But it's absolutely fascinating area to do research. And here, many of the areas have been glaciated. So glaciation has just come and swept through and obliterated a lot of history. And a lot of these species, a lot of these individuals, most of these trees you see are just new, I don't know, 10,000 years old or something, somewhere around there. So that's a fairly young environment. Oh, wait a sec. I'll go back. So here's, how much more time do I have?
10 minutes.
Okay, maybe I'm doing okay. So now I want to go with trees here. So the major points, I just want to show some connections. So there's connections between trees and fish. Remember when we were kids, for Thanksgiving, our folks would say, well, the pilgrims, the Indians taught them to plant, with the corn, fish. So it turns out that Robert Naiman up at the University of British Columbia in southwestern, British Columbia, he found that these historical migrations of salmon and anadromous fish that would come and spawn and die in the rivers, they would fertilize the riparian areas. And it's like tons of fish food, tons of fertilizer for the trees. And white bark pine I'll talk about briefly. It's an amazing species. Most of you know white bark pine. Goes in timberlines. A timberline species, it's absolutely an amazing species of pine. And I'll go into that a little bit. And it's really dependent upon this really interesting mutualism between it and the Clark's nutcracker. It's amazing. They couldn't live without one another. And there's a book called Made for One Another that I highly recommend. I brought a copy. I hope it's in my pack. And it talks about worldwide about the relationship between some of the pines and some of the birds. And if the pines are not all the same, and I'll give you a little cartoon of that. And then oaks and bird habitat and western juniper and grazing and quaking aspen. So I hope to get through all this with the remainder of the time. So here's a picture of Paul Bunyan. And what does it say? That tree just isn't lumber, it's history. So that's what Robert Naiman did. He looked at all these, took all these cores out of all these trees, thousands of them. And he did a master chronology, and he found out, oh, these are, in these trees, in this area, the rings are all falling apart. They're growing fast. So then he got other guys to do cores for the soil. They dug up that, and then they dated it, and they found out all the fish scales are around the same time, so that they correlated at a really big scale. The historical fish, salmon fish runs with the growth rate of the trees in a really robust manner. Just amazing. And so there's the salmon. This is up Woolly Creek. This is the Marble Mountains. So the fish migrate up, they die, bears come and eat them, they drag them a little ways, sometimes quite a ways away from the riparian. So some of these areas are rich because of the fish. Here's the Clark's nutcracker, a member of the corvid family. Crows, ravens, they're smart, really smart. I tried to study the blue jay in Florida once in the Florida scrub jay and the interactions, and I figured, no, they're smarter than I am. I can't study them. They were really smart. And I don't know I can't remember all the statistics for this, but there's people that have done all these dissertations and postdocs and study these things. These guys, okay, if you put a bag over the cone of these white bark pine, you put barbed wire or something, or not barbed wire, but chicken wire or something around it, come back the next summer, all the seeds are rancid. They haven't left the cone. They cannot leave the cone. What helps them to leave the cone? That critter, the Clark's nutcracker. And if you look at, now this is just various cones. I just got a subsample, seeds. But if you look at the seeds of pine trees, some of them in the world are heavy and they don't have wings. Other seeds of pines are light, and they have wings. So why have a wing? It helps, like the samara of a maple tree. It kind of comes and slows the fall down, the wind picks it up, and it balloons it off, right? Because we all know it's not good to have sex with your parents. That's one of the biological laws. That's like a no-no, and thousands of species of life on Earth have all these adaptations to avoid that. This bird functions in that way. The record and their pouch, they have this big pouch, I forget what it's called, underneath their tongue. It's like a big bag. And they can hold like 18 or 20 seeds. And they deliver, in a season, over 10,000 seeds. They take, and the farthest biologists have found, 18 miles. So they're not going to interbreed with the adult, with the parent. In the Amazon, it's the fish in the Amazon. The fish, when the Amazon gets big, the fruit from all the trees fall in the water, and it's the fish that have evolved in that way. And so it's a big story. So you can see that these are the heavy ones, and those are the ones that fall away. And if you read this book, you'll find out this is a kind of interesting phenomenon. You can see in different species around the world. So now we have black oak. So in the Pacific Northwest, there's two species of deciduous oak, the black oak and the Oregon oak. And from what I've read in the literature, of all the forest types, I guess outside the riparian, it's the oak woodlands that support the most species of birds. But many of them are being, through fire suppression, everything outcompeted by conifers. So I just wanted to draw some attention to that. Swainson's hawk is here. It's on this. This is western juniper. We all know western juniper in Siskiyou County, right? So there's a huge story there of fire suppression. It's grown all over. And this Swainson's hawk. Any of you knew or know Brian Woodridge? He was a biologist here for Klamath National Forest. And he was studying in Butte Valley Swainson's hawks, and he just noticed there's not so many as there used to be. What's going on with this? So he got some money. I think it was $3,000 per radio transmitter. He got the Forest Service to buy 2 of them, to tag a couple of these. Maybe it was more, but I think it was a modest number. And he put them on the couple. He was able to, put them on a couple Swainson's hawks. One of them died, and the other, he was wondering where they overwintered. Nobody really knew where they overwintered. They overwintered 6,000 to 7,000 miles away, west of Buenos Aires in the Argentinian Pampas. So we can thank Brian Woodridge for that. So he went down there, and he was blown away, and he found out why the populations here were going down, because the agriculturalists there had the same problem with agriculturalists here. The ground squirrels, different species, the grasshoppers, so they put all this nasty, pesticides on them, and they were just dying like crazy. But that's a big story. Now, the other thing I'd like to say about this tree, though, is it's an endemic. It's native to our area. There's the area. It's endemic to this area. So there's a big range. But since I was a kid, since like the early 70s, it's really taken over. It used to be, like a savanna to a woodland, but now there's actually juniper forests. And what they've done is over time, let me slow down. I'm running out of time, huh? Okay. In the 1860s, when cow grazing really started up in Siskiyou County, we didn't know anything, but the cattle would come, they'd graze out all the ground layer, all the bunch grasses that grow slowly, that can manage and survive through the summertime, the Mediterranean climate. So there used to be this big hulking ground layer of all this wonderful vegetation. John Muir wrote a little bit about it, and when he walked across the Central Valley. But the cattle came in. It was good. It was they love that forage. It was a fantastic forage. Even Mark Twain wrote about it in Roughing It. But anyway, the bunch grasses and some of these grasses that the cattle just love. So they chewed it all out and they exposed the ground layer, and it was like down to DG, decomposed granite or basalt, whatever it is, but down to the, bedrock or the soil and mineral soil, and then there wasn't. So then, guess what? This species, juniper, the seeds germinate really well on bare mineral soil. They don't do so well on duck. They are so small that they don't have enough resources to get them deep enough roots to get down there. So, and the second big thing is because that ground layer and then another thing I didn't tell you about, you probably know this, but juniper, western juniper, it has there's this phenomenon called allelopathy, and that means that, some of the chamise does it, the chaparral. It's like you see these plants and there's like halos around it, where there's no, under the plant, and right around the edges of the shrub, there's no grasses, there's no forests, no plants. It's like a little desert. Well, this one kind of does that too. It has allelopathy, so not only is there not much ground layer, and now you get these junipers that are doing pretty well, and they're with their chemistry, they're suppressing these chemicals they produce. They suppress the ground layer vegetation. And the other thing I want to say before moving on to this, the next one is now that the ground layer's been depleted, there's nothing to enhance this fire return interval. So there used to be, it was such a big ground layer of bunch grasses and everything. The fire return interval, I don't know. I'm going to draw the fire return interval out of a hat, maybe around 15 years. I don't know what it was, but pretty frequent. Now it's all gone. So that's really the whole fire regime thing has changed. And it's going to be hard to get around that. We have to actually get a bunch of them, these trees, cut them down, put them in piles, and it's really overwhelming. Here's an awful photo, and we can skip it, but there's the photo point. I tried to get it off from this biologist that just gave it to me, emailed it to me, and it didn't come out. But this is the same point. That's like, I forget how many years ago, and this is more current, but in one, there's just the same place. One of them has a lot of trees, one of them doesn't. Okay, finally, the aspen. Aspen is the most widely distributed, quaking aspen, the most widely distributed tree in North America. And outside of riparian zones, it's thought to really function as what they call a keystone species. And that means that the species is affiliated or supports very diverse plant communities. A lot of birds nest there. It's a really important habitat, and now it's getting encroached by encroachment, under the fire suppression regime. There's a lot of firs and everything that come in, or conifers that come in. So it's even in the marbles where I do research, it's losing ground, but it's a very diverse environment. If you don't know about aspen, it's amazing. You see all these aspen trees, we think of trees, they're sprouts. The trees, when we think of trees, don't last very long, maybe 100 years or longer. But those are just the sprouts. The individual, the genetic individual, I think they think it's the biggest organism on Earth. They're huge. Some of them go for many square miles, so it's like, it's all one individual, and all we see are the little sprouts that come and go. So it's a really old, stable part of a community. And now through fire suppression, and then this is a long story, but I'll say one other thing about it in the next slide, and I'll stop. But it's a big story, like after the Yellowstone fire in Yellowstone National Park. Aspen still hasn't really come back because there weren't enough wolves for a while, because the wolves eat the elk, and the elk eat the aspen. So like in the Marble Mountains where they've introduced elk, and now there's fire suppression, there's elk used to kind of it's a really big story, it's not. But it's like a cobweb of stories. But it's a real food web. So I think that's all I have to say. I did it.
So we have about a little over a half hour to ask questions that I hope that you've been writing down and remembering for Bill and Rob. So I'd like to invite Bill and Rob both back up and let's get your questions out.
For Bill, how much of the Earth's surface temperature, climatic temperature, is due to solar gain, and how much is due to heat rising from magma?
Almost all is external solar insolation. Sorry, Elaine?
Well, I was going to ask, I wanted to know more about the aspen, the wolves, and the elks.
Well, this guy came up, it all started with this guy, Slobodkin, that came up with this theory of why the world is green. It's really kind of over-theoretical, it's kind of crazy in a way. But it's like, if you think that there's all this green grass, right? And then there's a bunch of herbivores that eat the green grass. Then there's less green grass, right? But then if there's carnivores that eat the herbivores, then there's less herbivores, so there's more green grass. So that's like three. That's three trophic levels. Producers, herbivores, and primary consumers. Now if there's four, it changes again, and they say odd and even. I mean, it's just kind of bullshit a little bit. Because there's so many things going on, that people try to deal with this. I'm not a theoretician at all. I basically don't like theory. But these guys that study this stuff, they go to universities and they try to, kind of deal with these big concepts. But when you actually study nature, that's the fun part. You get surprised. You can get a chance to make discoveries. But it just means that the thing is really interesting and quite, when you get into it, that's the thing I guess I'd like to convey overall is that the world's a lot more interesting than most of us realize. With this Human Genome Project now, it's helped my field, ecology, a little bit because it's broadened it. One thing we've learned is it used to be the 2 strands of DNA. Now they think that there's a third. Guess what that third strand of DNA is? The environment. The genes by the environmental interaction is huge for the evolution of species of life on Earth. It's gigantic. And now we're finding the environment is very complicated things. So that's an example.
Question in the back here?
Yeah, does the chemtrail spraying affect the health of the trees in the ecosystem? Not the contrails, but the chemtrails, which is short for chemical trails.
I don't know at all.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
Okay.
I don't know. I really don't.
Question right here?
I have a question for Bill. Can you tell the audience why it is that we never discovered dinosaur fossils in California?
We have.
No, we haven't.
California.
California wasn't here during the time of the dinosaurs. California was formed in 40 million years ago.
Yeah, it's all over.
There are dinosaur fossils in California.
No.
What about the great
No, those are much younger. Those are mammals.
They're Ice Age, yeah.
But the fellow down at Sierra College has made it a point of looking through rocks of appropriate age. And in the eastern part of the state, over in the Colorado Desert, there are dinosaur footprints in some of the sandstones there. But remember that most of California in the Mesozoic was marine. There wasn't a lot of exposed land. So the fossils that have been found, they're very sparse, and my understanding is they're thought to be animals that died on the shore, and their carcasses floated out and then eventually sank.
Yeah, on the western edge
if you go down to Sierra College, they have a museum there for the fossils that this fellow has found in California.
The western edge of the North American continent at the time ended halfway through Nevada. And there were a couple of volcanic islands where California
Right,
is now.
and that's sort of
But then the Farallon Plate, which was several hundred miles off of the coast, started going east and pushed everything up off of the floor of the ocean. That's why you can go around here up into the mountains, thousands of feet up, and find ocean animals, you know?
Right, yeah.
Is his name Dick Hilton?
Yes, Dick Hilton.
He's a cool guy, and he wrote a book published by UC Press on the dinosaurs in California, if I'm not mistaken.
They're pretty rare.
It's
but
really
they're
cool. I mean, I remember when I was in graduate school at Davis, I'd open up the Sacramento Bee and, hey, he's discovered a new one, you know?
But I mean,
pretty cool.
But sort of the main reason here is that California at that time was mostly marine,
Yes.
not primarily terrestrial. Dinosaurs are terrestrial animals. So we only see small numbers of them, those whose carcasses got into the ocean.
Yeah, I read a report by a scientist, and it was refuted afterwards. He was mistaking the bones of Ice Age monsters for dinosaur bones.
Well, I certainly haven't heard that. So
Yeah.
We have a question right here.
Yes, for Bill, is it still the theory, Bill, that the Klamath province was connected to the Sierra Nevada?
yeah, probably geologically they're connected. When you look at that state geologic map, there's a portion where the rocks of the Klamath end, but there's volcanic rocks that have come down out of roughly where Lassen is today. So during the past several million years, 3 to 5 million years, there have been a series of stratovolcanoes in the Lassen area, the Lysen volcano and things like that. And they produced these big debris flows that swept down into the northern Sacramento Valley. And then those deposits have largely covered up the Klamath-type rocks. But then south of those, in the gold rush country of the northwestern Sierra, you pick up the same terranes again. And they can be correlated with sort of varying degrees of certainty between outcrops in the Klamath and outcrops in the Mother Lode country.
Well, I had read, though, that the Klamath had been moved some 60 miles or so. Is that?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if it's possible to tell if it's there. There's a book, Roadside Geology in California. Yeah. And the two guys who wrote that are from Montana, and they have some theories that I really haven't seen other people propose. So it may be sort of unique to them. But it's a little bit hard to know, have the Klamaths been pushed 60 miles westward, or was there simply original topography along, the coast was not straight. And there's no reason it had to be straight. So, but you can certainly correlate rocks in the Klamath with rocks in the northwestern Sierra.
I'd like to make a correction on one of the things that was on the screen. The statement that most of this serpentine is in the Klamath Mountains. I live in Quincy, which is basically, it's in the Plumas County, and it's the headwaters for the Feather Rivers. And the Feather River Canyon, which is north of Oroville, has whole sides of the mountain which are completely serpentine.
Well, your slide showed, it showed that serpentine belts down in the south
Right.
part of the state.
Basically, the serpentinite it's associated with terrane accretion, right? It's oceanic lithosphere that didn't subduct.
Right.
And so there's been a history of failed subduction all along the western edge of North America. So there's little outcrops of serpentinite starting down, near Fresno, all along the western edge of the Sierra,
Yes.
and then up into the Klamath, and then up into Oregon as well. And then if you noticed on this map, they're also in the Appalachians, right? Because the Appalachians were formed when first Northern Europe and then Africa collided with Eastern North America, and pieces of the ocean lithosphere there were moved. So there are serpentinites in Appalachia as well.
Yes.
So I don't know about that statement, but they certainly look abundant. They're also by the way, they're also in the California Coast Range, because you still have ongoing subduction today, and so there are blocks of serpentine in the Franciscan Formation, which makes up most of the California Coast Range.
Sorry, did you get your hand up?
Two questions. One, I had heard that the age of sheetrock, that it's like the oldest stones on the continent or something.
It's Western Cascade Volcanics, and I don't know if there's been modern dating of it. Back when sort of reconnaissance dating was being done in this area, they would do what they call whole rock potassium argon. So they collect a fresh sample of the rock, grind it up, analyzed one split for potassium, analyzed the other split for argon, and knowing the decay rate, you could calculate an age. But the problem was, argon's an inert gas, and when it forms by the decay of the potassium, it tends to leave the crystal it's in and get stuck along grain boundaries, and it's not necessarily in the crystals. And so those Forearc ages were sort of poor, qualities poor on those. And for example, the age of the Pluto basalt, Pluto's cave basalt, is very important because it overlies the debris avalanche deposit. So it provides the debris avalanche had to be older than the age of the Pluto cave basalt. And that was given back when they did Forearc potassium argon ages. I think they gave the age of the Pluto's cave basalt as 0.3 plus or minus 0.1 million years. It was a very inaccurate age, had a big error window on it. Nowadays, when they do potassium argon dating, they go out and actually collect the crystals of the feldspar that have the potassium in them, clean them, put them in an evacuated chamber, and melt them with a laser. And they can quantitatively then get all the argon out of the crystal, make it a much more accurate analysis. And now I forget what the error on it is, but it's, the age of the Pluto basalt is 160,000 plus or minus 10,000, something like that. So they've taken the error down from 100,000 years down to 10,000. And now the Pluto's basalt is 160. So that's it. So I don't know if modern single crystal potassium argon or argon dating has been done on sheetrock or not, but sheetrock will fall somewhere in between about 35 and 17 million years. It's part of that western Cascade suite.
Okay, and the second question, the debris field in the Shasta Valley, I heard that was from an explosion from a volcano. You're saying it's a landslide?
There's no evidence of any juvenile material in that. No sign of anything that was newly erupted at that time. I mean, that would be great, because then that could be dated with, say, potassium argon dating, and you could get an exact time for that event. And as it stands now, what we've done is they've dated some of the blocks in the debris avalanche, and I think the youngest of those come out around 360,000. So we know the old ancestral Mount Shasta was standing at about 360,000 years, and then it collapsed. We don't know exactly when. And then the Pluto's cave basalt laps over it at 160,000. So you can say, well, the collapse occurred sometime in that window. But so it would be really nice if there were juvenile material, but as far as we can tell, it wasn't a volcanic event. It was simply, stratovolcanoes like Mount Shasta, as imposing as they are not very strong. There's often a lot of explosive eruptions and pyroclastic debris, and so they're kind of weak inside. And then often magma cooling inside the mountain circulates hot water. So you've got a hot spring system at the surface, at the summit today. And that alters the rock so that it's not fresh. It's altered to clay and other minerals that are weaker even than it was when you begin. And so basically these edifices, because they have a lot of pyroclastic debris in them and because they're altered internally, are really subject to failure. And as far as we can tell, that's what happened with ancestral Mount Shasta.
So did it take thousands of years for that avalanche, or was it a singular event?
Probably going over 100 miles an hour. I think probably happened in a few minutes.
Bruce?
Yeah, Robert, in your presentation you mentioned the impacts that cattle grazing had on changing some of the plant composition, the bunch grass and that. When I visited the Marble Mountains, I've been kind of taken aback by how much cattle grazing is still happening in the wilderness area there. Do you see that as having like ongoing impacts on biodiversity and plant life in that area?
Well, you asked me this, and 20 years ago I wouldn't have answered it the way I answered it now. One of my jobs when I was at UC Davis was to screen students coming in at university to be graduate students, and so I had to call up this one potential graduate student at UC Davis, and he said, well, I'm from Siskiyou County, and I'm really against cattle grazing in the wilderness, particularly the Marble Mountains and stuff like that. And I said, well, I do research there, and already I've done 20 years for, 15 years of research there or something. And he said, well, I'd like to get your data. I'll find a way to show that, how bad the cattle are. And I said to him, well, I don't think that's the interesting question. For me, the interesting question about as a scientist, the interesting question about cattle grazing is if you hold cattle grazing constant, a given level of trees per hectare, cattle per acre, whatever it is, and then vary the environmental context. You know, maybe you'll have some on serpentine, maybe you'll have some on another soil type, and then see what the variation there is. I said, then you find out, well, you can get a certain amount of cattle grazing on a sustainable basis in this kind of environmental situation. And this other kind of situation, it's just going to go belly up really fast because it's a more fragile environment. Marble Mountains is absolutely amazing, and so is the Klamath area for research on this stuff. So, but that's what I said 10 years ago. Now what I say is there are definite areas in the Marble Mountains where they overgrazed it and it's just horrible. It's just flat out. The range scientists, I was really good friends with Vicki Van Sickle, who was the range scientist for out of the Scott River Ranger District in the Marble Mountains, and we collaborated on some research for years. And she did a pretty good job. Now she's gone, and so I don't know who else is in there, what's happening, but they've, Lower Right Lake. That's horrible. Lower Right Lake, you know where it is? It's near Boulder Peak, the highest point in Marbles, 8,299 feet. Right below that, you know how when you go to, certain meadows and there's all these streams that kind of wander around, this overhanging clusters of, rushes and roots and, all these different plants. And, now it's all channelized. It's just like the cattle have come in there and it's all sandy and all the vegetation's gone and they're just rolling around in the dust and it's really sad. And in fact, I was talking with, Doug Andrews. His daughter, he died a few years ago. He worked there as a trail maintenance guy for 40 years. Amazing. Wonderful, wonderful person. GS5 for 40 years. Amazing individual. He's so smart. He got the guys that got the Stanford Nuclear Accelerator, the principal guys from Stanford University, to come up and redo English Peak and to paint it. Amazing. He was a great guy. He taught me a lot about the marbles, and I don't know how much to go into this. Maybe I'm wondering. I should just stop. But I could go on and on and on about the grazing. But he kind of taught me that some of the environments really are much more fragile than others. And it's his daughter that now has taken his place, Laura. And she says that they can't even get funding to restore some of the overgrazed areas in the Marble Mountains because they're overgrazing. It's this whole weird circular thing. They're screwing it up so much. I never would have said that 10 years ago. It's just more, but that's my non-scientist part of me that's talking now. But there's problems.
Yeah, I wonder, do we know how big the ancestral Mount Shasta was?
Based on the volume of the debris avalanche, if you sort of pile it all back up, they estimate it was about the same size as the modern mountain,
Okay.
about 4,300 meters.
Just fatter.
Question right here?
Oh, I would just like to say there's a very interesting TED Talk by a man named Alan Savory, who has started to introduce cattle to desert areas, and it's reversed the desertification because the cattle kind of dig up the soil with their hooves, and then they have to be moved all the time. But if they're moved, then the grasses come back. It's a very interesting talk.
Yeah, it's been used as a technique. They use it, for specifically for some things, like some grasses that are introduced in the Mediterranean climate, annual grasses particularly, are problems. They grow really high, really fast in the spring, and then they set seed before summer. Where the old bunch grasses, they grew more slowly, they didn't grow as fast. They hung on to their resources, they were more persnickety, more selfish with their resources, but they were able to actually survive. So what happens is some of these annual grasses that are introduced, almost all of them are from Europe. 90% of the biomass of the Central Valley is today, they're from Europe. your annual grasses, they grow up high. And they put shade now below the natives. And the natives can't survive, so they're out of there. And the other ones don't care because they just get through the hard times with their seeds. So what they do sometimes in some situations is they have cattle come out and they munch on the annuals and they pull them away so that there's more, more light energy for the photosynthesizing plants in the understory of a higher grass community, thanks to the introduced species. That's one part of the answer.
I just wanted to ask, I really appreciated your presentation about the relationships between different systems. I thought that was just fabulous, the fish in the forest. I have another question about change. My understanding is that the oats were introduced from Spain or from ships that came over. That was how they were, when they were swept out, when the holds of ships were swept out after they landed.
Yeah.
They're all over the oak woodland. I mean, it's almost a monotite understory.
Definitely.
Has there been an impact of the oats on changing the oak woodland?
Oh yeah, I mean,
what are they doing to the oaks? Is it positive or negative? Or?
It's like a lot of ecology. It's really a complicated story. I actually had a grant to study oaks regeneration. You know, the Central Valley, right? Mm-hmm. And then the next life zone above that, the blue oak, it's like, the Central Valley is like, you can think of it as a bathtub, and then the bathtub ring, the dirty part. But the next life zone up is the blue oak woodland, right? You look at that, there's almost no recruitment of blue oaks all over the whole Central Valley. The next life zone up. So it's like desertification. It's like we're losing that entire life zone. And it's probably going to be lost. And the reason that it's going to be lost is, I don't have the answer, I don't know. But one theory is that the introduced grasses, the annual grasses from Europe, they come in spring. You know, we get the spring rains, and springtime we get the rains, and then in summer it gets really dry. So the annuals, they come, and they just suck up a lot of water fast. They grow really fast and really tall. They set seed and they're out of there. So some people say that really influenced they just suck up the soil moisture. They have a fast evapotranspiration process. They just suck up all the soil from the natives, who grow really more slowly, but the natives can actually handle the tough times and keep on photosynthesizing and living. So that's part of the answer, but it's a sad thing. I love oaks, and I think it's really sad that whole life zone it's probably going to be lost. You know, I mean, I've cored more than my fair share of oak trees. I probably cored 1,000 oak trees, counted all the ages, did this big study for the state of California. They said, what do we do? And I said, I don't know. Protect the areas. You can put fences around it. I came up with all these managing things, but what really can you do? I mean, it's a huge area. That's what's happening. I mean, all you just try to educate yourself as much as you can and help everybody. The part of the talk I wanted to give that I didn't get to give was the whole Pacific flyway. That's another thing about Siskiyou County, the whole Klamath Basin story. And that's one thing I thought about talking about grasses, since we're on the topic. When the cattle went up to English Peak, the soil scientists they used to cattle graze in between English Peak and, Tom Taylor Cabin, English Peak, that amphitheater there. What happened was they had a lot of grazing, we overgrazed it. But what happened was the cattle actually, they munch on all this food. They put it, they grow. Then they leave. And then, they're sold. That's the way it works. But the problem is they removed a lot of the living biomass, the grass. And according to Tom Loren, who's now retired as the soil scientist out of the SO office in Wairika, he was a soil scientist. He went up there and he studied the soils and everything. Thanks. I have this, it's published in the Journal of Soil Science or something. It changed the pH. They took so much, the cattle took so much biomass out of there and exported it, that changed actually the whole pH of the soil. And you went from a complete conversion of one soil type I mean, one ground layer vegetation type to another. So that's the thing about all this stuff. It's just, our learning curve, I mean, I have letters from my relatives coming over the Rocky Mountains, late 1800s. I mean, things are going fast, and we're not learning that much. We're kind of like way behind the 8 ball. But anything you can to help preserve things or anything, educate yourselves. I mean, I learned a lot just getting to give this talk.
We got a question back there.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, it seems like a recurring thing you're talking about now is that overgrazing in some of the oaks and that, I mean, they will munch young oaks. They know with feral pigs and different things that the oaks and acorns are really favored by most, all the species that eat plant material. So one of those things where a lot of the young trees, recruitment's real low. But if you look at the elk and the aspen, similar deal where they were overgrazed a lot. But I'm just speaking from general knowledge. We've seen that the absence of those predators, when you have these large ungulates able to stay in an area, be totally there where the green is, but stay by the water. And as the summer goes through, they're phoning in on anything green, and they'll be just, it doesn't matter if it's shrubs sometimes or grass. They'll eat what's green and viable. So that overgrazing aspect, when you start losing, and savory methods are actually moving large ungulates. It's like what happens in Africa. That's where he studied. The different rain events and the ecosystems have adapted to these series of grazers that come through, but they're always constantly moving. They move with the rains and move quite large distances, just like caribou and all these, most ungulates, but not some like deer are more localized, but they'll, through that method, you lose some of that overgrazing, that focus, and through predators and everything, they don't have that ability to be back and that able to, manipulate an environment for a long time with the help of man, cowboys or this or that. So you, kind of eliminate some of that predation. They can focus, and they're so large and heavy that they degrade banks, watersheds. They do a lot of damage in that.
Yeah. You read The Ghost of Evolution. And those of you that, like the Pleistocene extinctions and all, California used to have as many gazelles as Africa, not too long ago, 10,000 years ago. So there used to be tons and tons and tons and lots more species of ungulates and lots more species of grazers than there are today. Then they went extinct.
So I think we have one more question, and then we'll have to, any further questions beyond that, and maybe you can speak with Bill or Rob and get their contact information and ask them directly. We'll take this one last question up here, and then we'll wrap up.
Well, this could be one of those things I should wait till after. You mentioned part of the San Juan de Fuca plate.
Oh, that's him.
Maybe.
That must be him.
Well, I'm putting you both together. Wandered into the northwest coast from Asia someplace. Is that true?
Well, the Border Juan de Fuca Explorer plate system is part of what was once a much larger plate.
Right.
The Pharaoh.
Well, I'm just using that, I'm leading into something that isn't really a question, but it's a whole other topic. I think more for him, but recently the Fukushima thing left a dock loose and ended up in the coast of Oregon. What I'm getting at is
earthquake in Japan.
What I'm getting at is the notion of invasive species.
Yeah.
And you talk about how with our cattle culture, we've changed the pH of the soil, and therefore the grasses do better and the oak trees are dying out. I just want to get some comments from you guys on the notion of invasive species and trying to eliminate them.
Well, I think it's like a triage. It's like, a triage where you work for an ambulance company and you come upon some real tragedy and there's tons of people sprawled out on I-5 and you look at the guy with a broken leg and forget it, You look at some guy with, that's dying, needs your help and it's just going to die no matter what. And you look at somebody else and I think you have to pick your battles with this because some of these invasives are just really a big deal. I think, You know, though, I think, I'm not a negative guy. I think nature's really strong. I think, you know, we're gonna experience some losses, but it's what we as an American people really have the will to be able to, what we desire. I really think human beings are incredible. I mean, so I think that we have the will, though. I mean, Siskiyou County is like a dysfunctional family. You know, if we could get together as a family, I mean, we have 18th century water law, we have the, you know, Klamath Upper Watershed, part of it's in Oregon, part of it's in California. Oregon has separate laws, statutes than we have down there. Then there's the Indians against the cowboys, against the tree huggers.
Well, I think
it's just a mess.
What I'm getting at, the one word I left out is Malthus. Malthus.
Yeah.
You know, and that we're in this kind of circus time because the human species has occupied such a, I mean, can anything be done is the question. I don't, you know, I'm not asking for an answer, but it's we that are creating all these things. And the only answer was Malthus pointing out the population level has a lot to do with this.
Yeah, something's got to become limiting sooner or later. But human beings are just amazingly inventive. I mean, it's just, I've been trying to catch up on the literature, the technical literature, just the field methods. And I mean, there's the scientific methods in the last 10 years. It's amazing. I have a pile of books, literally, like that, I want to get through. I don't know, I feel kind of positive about things. I think that there's a lot we can do. I have one of my oldest friends, he's probably in his 70s now, but he's one of the principal guys for restoring the Greater Everglades ecosystem, which is a lot like the Klamath in some areas. Agriculture, amazing flyway, big area, and all the water comes in through one channel. They're doing a pretty good job trying to work on restoring that. So for me, the glass is half full on that. We just have to have the will. We have to say, this is what we want. And we have to kind of make tough decisions. And if we can do that, then I think there's a chance, a really good chance. But if we're all arguing and throwing up our hands and crying.
But a chance of what?
What?
A chance of what?
Turning the tide.
Turning the tide, you know. Whatever our desirable
Restoring past ecosystems?
Yeah. It's going to be amazing what we're going to be able to do in some ways, I think. I think it's...
No, it's an interesting topic to me.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating.
And on that note, we're going to have to wrap up because there's another event coming in. But I want to thank Dr. Bill Hirt and Dr.